Welcome to the Energy Central Power Perspectives podcast, the show that brings leading minds from the energy industry to discuss the challenges and trends that are transforming and modernizing our energy system. And a quick thank you to West Monroe, our sponsor of today's show. Now, let's talk energy. I'm Jason Price, Energy Central podcast host and director with West Monroe, coming to you from New York City. And with me, as always, from Orlando, Florida, is Energy Central producer and community manager Matt Chester. In the U.S., there are 18 national labs, each committed to pioneering work in their respective fields. Many of these labs were established after World War II to continue research and further our understanding of our complex world. Much of what is commercialized today and exists in the background of our everyday lives finds its roots from the men and women who work at or once served in the national labs. The question of energy security is top of mind on today's episode. We're going to meet the people who are looking at trying to forecast and plan for the energy future. What will supply and demand look like? Where will supply come from? How will it function in the society of tomorrow? Many of the top minds trying to answer these questions come from Idaho National Lab. It's the lab's specific quest to address nuclear energy, national security, energy, and the environment. And as the work is done, we're aiming on this podcast to bring on leading experts who can provide insight for our listeners on these difficult questions. So Matt, today we actually have the good fortune to have another conversation with leaders from INL. But before we dig in, can you give us a rundown of previous guests who have been on our show from Idaho National Lab?
Sure, Jason. Yeah, we learned about how nuclear power and microgrid technology can make an ideal pairing with John C. Kantasamy and Kurt Myers back in episode 108. And then on episode 118, Timothy Pennington joined us to discuss the ways in which INL is working towards the EV charging infrastructure future. And now we get to add today's episode to this list.
Yes, Idaho National Lab has indeed been a welcome presence on this podcast. And today is actually a 2-for-1, as we also have a guest joining us from the nation's leading academic department focused on nuclear energy found at the University of Michigan. These two guests are here today to discuss some envelope-pushing innovation they've been collaborating on, known as the Emerging Energy Markets Analysis. First, we have Steve Aumeier, Senior Advisor on Strategic Programs at Idaho National Laboratory. Steve, welcome to today's episode.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Appreciate the invitation.
And we also have Todd Allen, the Professor and Department Chair at the University of Michigan's Department of Nuclear Engineering and Radiological Sciences and founding director of their Fastest Path to Zero initiative. Thanks for joining us today, Todd.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. Glad to be part of the conversation.
Absolutely, and we're thrilled to have you on. Before we get into it, I'd love if we could have more context on the Emerging Energy Markets Analysis Initiative at Idaho National Lab. Steve, can you please provide the context? How did this program start, and what are the initiative's main goals?
Yeah, it's interesting. The initiative's been around for a few years now. The idea really came about around Christmas time in 2019. We were having a conversation with John Wagner, who is now the lab director of Idaho National Lab. And we were talking a little bit about how the lab could and probably should develop a deeper capability to help both lab and also stakeholders kind of get ahead of all the various issues surrounding energy transitions. And especially the transitions being driven by more interest and more demand for low and zero emission energy, and really try to understand how that would impact technologies that we're developing, but also how it might impact communities, especially our surrounding communities. Talked a lot about what has worked in that area, in that realm, what hasn't worked. Importantly, really talked a lot about what is key to really make an impact in understanding energy transitions, and came to the conclusion that building that sort of deep competency really depended principally on being able to take a multifaceted, multidisciplinary look at the problems, at the challenge, not just about technology, but being able to understand the social dimensions of energy transitions, being able to better understand the finance, and really very importantly, how business innovation has to intersect technology innovation and also how regulatory innovation is going to come into that. Really, what we're talking about is the need to understand value, holistic value propositions around energy choices and especially community-centric value propositions. And really what we came to is a realization that what better way to do that is to build partnerships with some of the best minds from a number of different fields. So by late 2020, right in the heart of the dreaded COVID lockdowns, Emma was born. And it was born really to provide insight and analyses, thought leadership, to help both laboratory, but mostly help communities, companies, and other stakeholders make value-based decisions about energy and really very interesting and important energy-based economic development. So that's how Emma came about. Been around now for going on 3 years and making a lot of difference, I think.
Fantastic. Very helpful. Thank you. And speaking of top minds, we have with you, one of your colleagues is Todd Allen. So Todd, with your role being centered on nuclear energy at the University of Michigan, how did you get involved with Emma?
Yeah, thanks. So as background, it's important to know Steve and I have known each other since grad school, right? So we've been working on things together on and off for the past 30 years. So we had a good working relationship to start with. I came to the University of Michigan in January of 2019. I had a very specific goal in starting the Fastest Path initiative, which was to get academic nuclear engineering departments in the country to think beyond technology, right? You're going to deploy nuclear technology. Developing the engineering part, the technical part's important, but academic departments in the U.S. did not address things like social, economics, other things, right? So I started this initiative to really help push our department in that direction. Just before Emma got started, Steve and I co-wrote a paper on issues in science and technology that was aimed at what's the future of nuclear energy, what's necessary to make it successful. And so when Steve posed the idea of Emma, it made a lot of sense for us to join. We had a very top nuclear engineering department. He was able to bring in partners at University of Alaska and University of Wyoming that are in states that are sort of pushing the boundaries of how we might deploy nuclear technology. And I think a lot of things made a lot of sense for me to join the partnership because it aligned with things we wanted to do, and it allowed us to help the lab, right, who in many cases have a bigger voice than the universities.
And if I understand this, the secret sauce or special sauce of Emma is bringing together global leaders in various fields, including engineering and technology, social science, law, economics, natural resource policy, cultural studies, public and regulatory policy, and stakeholder engagements to provide more of a holistic view of the energy markets of the future with an innovative perspective. So, Steve, we'll start with you. Why is this approach so unique, and why hasn't this already been done before?
So backing up a little bit on building a bit on what Todd mentioned about the nature of the complexity in energy transitions, and especially with the states that he mentioned, with Alaska and Wyoming. So by its very nature, energy touches everything we do, right? So by its nature, it's highly multidisciplinary. It should be something that's looked at through a highly multidisciplinary lens. It isn't always approached like that. Now, the lab is really good at technology, right? We're all about technology. We do that really well. But energy markets, and especially changes in those markets, are, like Todd was saying, it's more than about technology. We need to consider what's really acceptable, what's practical, not just at a national level, not just at a state level, but a local level. And then how do all those local considerations really get put together. And I think some people do that well on small scales, but we really want to do that, develop a team that can be tapped in to do that on a much bigger scale. What's really important isn't just the disciplines that our team brings to the table. It's really deep understanding that they bring. So what do I mean by that? The states, the participants that we brought together with Emma really are experts that are within communities, like Todd mentioned, are right in the middle of energy transitions that are touching the fundamentals of their communities, the fundamentals of their economics, fundamentals of their state budgets, which touches everything. So having experts that aren't only experts in their field, but are living the various aspects of energy transitions was really important. I think that's fairly unique with Emma as an ongoing enterprise. So it's not just about the skill that's brought to the table. It's a lot about the perspective that these folks bring. There's an old saying that goes that innovators change the lens through which they see the world. I like to think of Emma as an innovator's lens.
Yeah, I would agree. I would even describe it as almost like an exercise in scenario writing of what the future would look like, and it's something that, I mean, even like Hollywood, the industry of Hollywood looks at what does the world's future look like, and then creating a whole storyline or movie line behind that. There's also scenario writing presents opportunities to really think in multidimensional ways to portray what the future would look like. So I want to pull on that thread a little bit, if I may. We focus on things like the grid mix and the ability of the power sector to meet rising demand, but you're also exploring the unique economic and social conditions that may not be getting enough attention. Can you share with us some of the example outcomes that you have come from, this initiative? What new perspectives have you been able to bring to those focused on energy markets? Maybe Steve, again, we can start with you, and then certainly Todd chime in.
Yeah, Jason, I think what you said about scenario writing, it's really about being able to help people see beyond maybe what they see today. There's a couple really great examples of how we've gone about that, the process for going about that, but also when different communities and folks have reached out to us to actually ask us to do that. So let's talk about some specifics on how we've been able to do that. A couple studies come to mind. First of all, studies that our team members have done. One study, I think, has been very helpful for people in Alaska and people wanting to do business in Alaska to take a look at micronuclear reactor applications in different types of markets, both grid markets, remote industrial markets, and community markets. And that study was led by our colleagues at the MIT Sloan School. It looked at essentially, would microreactors be competitive with existing ways of providing heat and power in those various markets? Long story short, they're very competitive. What was interesting with that MIT study is they asked the question, at what capital cost would they be competitive? So they didn't make a lot of assumptions about what new technologies were going to cost. They simply said, what is the cost ceiling? And what we found is in all three of those deployment cases, you had a very competitive technology with microreactors. Now let's look at another study that one of Todd's colleagues at the University of Michigan did. It got a lot of attention, and it focused on whether microreactors and small nuclear reactors might be a competitive advantage as we look at fuel switching in heavy transportation. What do I mean by that? As we begin to shift heavy trucking from diesel fuel to either electric or hydrogen, how might small reactors fit into that? So Michael Craig at the University of Michigan and his students did a really interesting study on what the financial dimensions of that would be. And bottom line, it showed that in certain circumstances, microreactors would be quite competitive. We've done a couple different studies on community, I don't want to say community acceptance, but community views on both nuclear energy in general, but also this unique question of, do those views shift if that nuclear generator is not a grid service device, but rather it's a nuclear reactor embedded within an industrial facility, powering, say, either a mine or a chemical plant. So our colleagues at University of Wyoming led some work that's still underway, taking a look at community acceptance, especially in that Wyoming market. We're just getting focused right now on what I think is going to be some really very interesting studies on nuclear applications in mining, and especially how that can impact the economic competitiveness in Arctic mining markets. In fact, our Emma team, along with some others, have a panel session accepted at the Arctic Circle Assembly. It's going to be in Reykjavik, Iceland, here in about a month and a half, 2 months. That's really exciting. I think we're gonna see quite a lot out of that. And we've done a lot, Jason, in simply having conversations with community groups that have been interested in learning more and specifically about nuclear energy in context these energy transitions. One of those, actually, Todd and I participated in the town of Gillette, Wyoming. The mayor and some of the local industrial companies invited us to have a conversation with the community about energy transitions and how nuclear energy of tomorrow might fit and how they might view applications. So in a short 2.5 years, we've actually done quite a lot. I think we've made an impact so far.
That's great. So Todd, your background is, and you're specifically focused on the nuclear energy sector. So let's hear from you. What are your thoughts on what Steve shared? And also just, nuclear, as we all know, has been around for quite some time. It's an old, new technology, I guess you could say. What changes do you anticipate coming from the sector? And what sort of new, refreshed perspectives should we all have with nuclear energy?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. That's a great question. So if you look at the first commercial generation of nuclear power plants, essentially one product. It was a very large electricity producing machine, right? We incentivized utilities to build those in the 60s, 70s, 80s when we were building a lot of plants. But my view is the energy system is changing a lot, right? And it's easy to see this in electricity. Right? You think about when I was a kid, it was pretty simple. We had these large central station power plants. They made electricity. They sent it over the transmission and distribution wires to people's homes. Now we've got variable sources like solar and wind. So we're taking advantage of the fact that the costs have come down a lot. They're coming on and off the grid. You need to balance that somehow with storage or baseload or demand response. And so you end up with a lot of different types of products that are new and needed, right, to make this system work. And so at the moment, I think a combination of climate change, need to go to lower carbon, zero carbon production options, energy security issues that have really been exacerbated by the Russian invasion in Ukraine, combined with the fact that there's a lot of different types of energy products that we need. You see a large number of nuclear companies, sort of innovators in the space, that are looking at different deployment scenarios. Instead of one commercial product, you see multiple, right? Large electricity, small electricity, individual user electricity, dedicated heat, combined heat and power. You sort of go through the list. And Steve talked about this in some of the examples, this idea of how are you going to provide charging infrastructure for heavy duty trucking. That's a very different scenario that we never had to do before. And so you have all these types of new products, and nuclear engineers are trying to figure out how to fit into that. But in order to fit in, they have to develop the technology that makes sense, that the market wants. It's got to be affordable. It's got to be socially acceptable. And how much of a technology gets deployed can be influenced by public policy levers. And so if you look at the Emma approach, it says we need to look at all those things. We need to look at technology. We need to look at economics. We need to look at social acceptance. We need to look at public policy levers. And I think it's sort of the moment in the sense that that's what nuclear engineering needs to do to be relevant in the future. And so I think Emma fits right in a very nice way.
Todd, when we were doing the research leading up to this podcast, on your website, you have a video and a narrative around, I guess you could call it the Korean model. So switching gears for a moment, what both of you and what Emma's trying to achieve seems to, if I'm understanding correctly, does exist outside of the United States and perhaps Korea is maybe personifying some of that. Can you talk about that? Share with us the Korean model with our audience a little bit?
Yes. For me, what's really fascinating about Korea is when they decided to make their initial investment in nuclear energy. This would have been post-World War II. You go visit Korea now, and it's a modern, industrialized country, and it is not what it was like upon World War II. They were not as wealthy a country, but they made this national decision, this national commitment to nuclear energy. And while that helped provide them energy over the years, also they developed skills in things like heavy manufacturing, right? And that allowed them to move into international commerce and things that are bigger and beyond nuclear energy. So there was a long-term commitment from the country to the technology that paid off in ways that might have been bigger than originally envisioned. And I think, to some of the studies that Steve talked about before, it's not exactly a direct parallel, but this idea that in the US, we could build new types of nuclear energy plants really only makes sense if you think about what are the deployment scenarios, what are the partnerships between the energy you produce and manufacturing or another business opportunity for a community, right? And I think what Steve has tried to get the Emma team to look at are those combinations, those deployment scenarios. And so I think the starting point of this discussion is different in that the U.S. now has a fairly well and robust set of national labs, industry, regulator, academic institutions. So we're starting at a very different point than the Koreans might have in World War II. But we have this opportunity to really pivot how we think about the technology and how it influences how we move forward in manufacturing and all of the jobs and things that go along with that. I think there's a lot of things we can be inspired by in what they did in Korea. I don't think it necessarily is as big a shift or as big a build for us because of the foundations that we already have.
Great. And before we go to the next question, I don't know, Steve, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think Todd's spot on, and I would just amplify what he mentioned about the importance of really digging into these deployment scenarios. So what I'd like to remind people when we talk about energy is I really don't care that much about what technology we're talking about first order. What I want to talk about is what do you want to do with the energy? What do you want to achieve? How's it going to give you a better way of life? How's it going to give you a competitive advantage? What does a group of people, what does a stakeholder, what does a community want to achieve in economic terms? And then let's talk about all this multi-dimensional richness of understanding what value a given energy source or technology brings to that. So yeah, we like to think first about what do you want to achieve, and then let's talk about the technology.
I want to ask you about the sense of urgency that seems to underlie Emma. If we look at throughout history, energy has always been a top issue. It helps define our self-determination as a country. And remember, as a kid in the 1970s, with the long lines of gas at the gas station. So energy is always an issue, whether now with climate change and other, but it's always been top of mind. However, there is a sense of urgency that Emma conveys. So my question to both of you, and Todd, let's start with you. Why now? Why is there this sense of urgency that is really pushing Emma into the forefront or more into the national conversation?
Yeah, I think you sort of pointed us in the right direction in the way you framed the question, right? I mean, over the history of people, we always want energy, right? Energy makes our lives better. And we always want it to be cleaner, more affordable. We want it to be resilient / reliable, right? We want it on when we want it. If it goes away accidentally, we want it to come back right away. I think in the last few years, we've started to talk more about equity and how we distribute the benefits and the costs of using energy. I think part of the reason why it seems very important right now are climate, right? And the need to move to zero carbon systems. If you look at the history of using energy, we always have moved towards lower carbon systems, right? If you're transitioning from like whale blubber to wood to coal to gas to renewables to nuclear, that's our general trajectory. Well, I think at the moment, the science is making it clear that we need to figure out how to make that happen faster. So I think that's one. And in a lot of cases, I think that's brought people back into the conversation around nuclear energy that may have dismissed it 40 years ago. I think energy security is the other. I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine has made this very visible for people, especially in Europe. But I think being able to control your own destiny is very important. And so I think the combination of those two things is really pushing on the need for an energy transition. Then you have the federal government do things like pass the Inflation Reduction Act, right? As an example, they're putting a lot of money into helping industry, right, kickstart this transition, right, build better products. So in the end, if we're going to use more clean energy, we have to build products that people really want, right? And so the government is pushing on this. I think a lot of things have come together. In addition to that, you have a lot of companies, right, that are willing to invest with private funds in these new products. For a lot of my career, right, the nuclear energy enterprise was more of a research enterprise. Right? It was a lot of work at the national labs and things. And I think these companies see there is this opportunity in new types of nuclear products, and they're pushing the system in that direction. So I think all these things have come together to make this, for me at least, a very unique time compared to the previous 30 years of my career.
Sure. That's very interesting and very compelling. Steve, if you could chime in on that, but give us a non-nuclear, perspective. What else? I mean, it's broader than just nuclear. So give us a perspective of Emma's goals in all this, if you don't mind.
Yeah, it is broader than just nuclear energy, but that's really why what Todd just put his finger on is so important. It's absolutely right. What gives us a sense of urgency, not just on the nuclear energy side, asking the question, how can nuclear energy be a bigger part of our security and response to climate change? Those are the two big drivers. And the energy security question is really being driven, I believe, in the future by what I would consider great powers competition. So why does that paint such an urgency for us right now? I think markets are speaking relative to the types of energy that we want to embed within industries, within the power grid and other applications, right? The markets are telling us, finance folks are telling us, equity folks are telling us, we're going to begin to monetize emission content of everything we do with energy. That includes products that we buy. So that creates a circumstance, along with the security questions that Todd mentioned, where a number of different markets globally are going to be disrupted, right? There's an opportunity for new entrants to come in with more efficient means of production, whether it be chemicals, whether it be manufactured goods or whatnot. The United States needs to establish leadership position in those changing markets, because the decisions that are made that are based on energy use and manufacturing and such, and the competitive position that's going to provide around the globe, those decisions are going to be made now, and they're going to have a very long tail. They're going to have a multi-generation long tail. So it's incredibly important that the United States do what we can to step up and lead in what I consider this new frontier of economic competition. That economic competition is this intersection of low emission economic activity overlaid on great power competition. So in the end, if we can help our especially our regional first movers in, say, nuclear energy, develop a position in global markets based on a value proposition that increases our security and lowers our emission footprint, that's going to put the U.S. in a better position. And that, in the end, is not just a regional economic development value. That's a value for national security. So you ask the question, why do we feel a sense of urgency? There should be a sense of urgency because we as a country are right at the forefront of this new frontier of competition.
I think if I could add on to what Steve said, and it goes back to your Korea question, the other thing that's happening is there's a lot of countries that are showing an interest in nuclear technology that may have never used it before. If you go back to the way that Japan and Korea built out their nuclear power programs, it was very much in strong partnership with the United States. So we were very happy with the safety protocols that they use and the security protocols. And to Steve's point, if we're moving into new markets internationally, another advantage of being engaged, okay, is that we can help those countries develop safety processes, security processes around using the technology that are consistent with the U.S. that we're comfortable with. And in order to make that engagement, we have to figure out what's their economic drivers, right? What is their vision of the future use of energy, right? So it gets very much back to the type of approaches that Emma's trying to use, and it goes beyond what we have talked about nationally into how we deploy nuclear internationally.
Yeah, and Jason, just one addition to what Todd said as well, and maybe it gets back to part of your prior question. Those questions aren't just about nuclear energy either. So like Todd said, as we go about, working with stakeholders and such and understanding deployment needs and how we address that dual challenge of competitiveness based on emission content and security, sometimes the answer is not nuclear energy. Sometimes it's a combination of nuclear energy combined with other energy sources. And sometimes, we need to think about what are better ways of powering different processes altogether or going about it, different industrial manufacturing activity differently. So by definition, we're looking beyond nuclear energy, but we do have a sense that advanced nuclear energy, especially in these different applications that Todd talked about, might just be, in many cases, a key that unlocks this door to much greater competitiveness in this new landscape that we're moving into. So it's really is an exciting time.
All right. I want to thank you for both answering the question. I want to ask you both to play a little bit more or continue the thought a little bit further. So the thinking here is that I think you're getting at, is that it's not just aspirational, sort of this new role of nuclear in our new frontier, but there may be an active role, not just aspirational. So maybe Todd, start with you. From a near-term perspective, what are some signs of Emma's impact that we all should be, say, looking for? And Steve, any thoughts to add to that above and beyond what Todd covers would be great.
Yeah, I think the thing I would point out is if you go back roughly 3 years when we started this and just look at what's happening in the U.S. states, right? So Steve mentioned previously, initial focus through our partnerships in Emma, strong look at Alaska and Wyoming. If I look at what's going on in state legislatures around the country, there is more and more an interest in the possibility of using nuclear energy. So you will see states overturning moratoria that they used to have on using nuclear energy. You have seen states that have transitioned from renewable portfolio standards to zero carbon standards. Right? They're saying it's important to just decarbonize. And in that viewpoint, you can look at nuclear energy. So clearly that's a signal to me that a lot of states, as they look forward, how are they going to decarbonize? What is the optimal path? Or in my group's language, what's the fastest path to zero carbon? You see nuclear as an option. And I think in each one of those cases, you're going to need an Emma-like approach to think about what's important to the state, what are the values, what are their current systems? And there will be opportunities to help them think through this future, right? So I think it's actually growing, and the need for Emma-like conversations is just going to get more and more important as time goes on. We see the signals.
Yeah, and to add on to that, maybe keeping with the nuclear energy theme as well, we are seeing much more demand And to your question, Jason, what else might we see? One example, one area that you're going to see us more involved in is a set of conversations and a framework for having those conversations that Todd mentioned that's being led by NARUC, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. So they have a partnership with the Department of Energy to execute what they call the Advanced Nuclear State Collaborative. And they've reached out to us in helping design that process and hopefully more in executing that Advanced Nuclear State Cooperative Group. That group is focused on a set of states that have really regulators and energy authorities and a group of states that have said, hey, we, our stakeholders within the state, are seeing these energy transitions, are seeing the economic potential of advanced nuclear energy in that context. And we'd like to band together to help each other with lessons learned, with capacity development, with best practices in developing nuclear-driven industries and also supply chains. That's kind of a big deal when you have 20 different states come together and say, hey, we want some help in putting together a construct for that sort of thing. The other area I think I know you're going to see quite a lot of activity with our Emma group is part of this broader frontiers initiative, if you will. We just talked about a moment ago this notion that our country is at a new frontier of economic competition. We believe very strongly that's a great opportunity. It's an opportunity for U.S. leadership, and there's a lot of threats embedded in that. So the sort of framework and the sort of thought process that our Emma team can bring to those conversations is being tapped into more and more. And you'll see us actually publish more on those topics and hopefully make a big impact on not just a regional level, but a national and then international level in the coming months and years.
Absolutely. And certainly the questions you gentlemen are trying to answer are really stretching our brains in many directions that really could only be addressed and driven out of the leadership at a national lab. So certainly appreciate the work, the tough work you're trying to solve for our country and our society. On that note, I'd like to pivot now to what we call our lightning round, which give us an opportunity to learn a little bit more about you, the person, rather than you, the professional. So we have a set of questions, 5 questions. It's a lightning round, so we ask that you keep your response to one word or phrase. We'll start with you, Todd, first, and then Steve, you can follow up. So question number 1, past or present, name the one scientist you most identify with and would invite for lunch. And of course, give us a little skinny on the scientist as well. Todd, go ahead.
So I after thinking about this, I'm going with Alvin Weinberg, who was a 1950s Cold War scientist, Oak Ridge National Lab director. And I think he had this very interesting career where he moved from technology to national leadership in programs. And I give him credit for recognizing that the nuclear industry focused very heavily on technology for a long time and didn't pay enough attention to the social issues. So I think he kind of inspired Emma 70 years ahead of time.
For me, Jason, that's easy. Maybe a little different choice. It's Teddy Roosevelt. Of course, we think of Teddy as a politician, as a president, but I think of him first as an adventurer. I think of him as a scientist from the time he was a little boy, bedbound, and doing his science experiments, all the way to exploring the River of Doubt in South America. So I think actually Teddy exemplifies what we're looking at right now, but on a much different frontier.
Okay, back to you, Todd. If you could bring one book or movie with you on a deserted island, what would it be?
Yeah, I decided to cheat on this question. So I'm going to go with the Neapolitan novels by Elena Ferrante by claiming that the 4 novels are actually one. And she's a great author, very engaging, and then I would get 4 times as much stuff to read while I'm stuck on the island.
Over to you, Steve.
Easy for me. I'd take the encyclopedia, if that counts as one book. I could sit and just read that forever.
And you could use extra volumes to kill fish and stuff. You just throw those out.
Todd knows me too well.
100 years from now, what will our energy mix look like?
So I think it's a mix of the zero carbon technology we have. So some wind, some solar, some hydro, some nuclear, some gas with carbon capture. We'll keep getting cleaner. We'll keep getting more affordable. But I don't think there's any specific one technology that does everything perfectly.
I agree with Todd. I just use two words, diverse and efficient, maybe with emphasis on efficient.
What would an alternative career path be if you hadn't found yourself in the energy industry?
I'm going with disc jockey. I vaguely recall that before I got the ROTC scholarship to go to Northwestern, I was thinking about becoming a disc jockey. That sounds fun.
Yeah, and if you do that, Todd, I would hire you any day. I'm going with medicine or environmental science.
Fantastic. And the last question. All right, so we've landed on the moon. We've turned gas cars into electric. We've lived through pandemics. What do you predict will be the next transformative event to happen in mankind?
Yeah, I'm not sure this is transformative as much as still just part of the process. But I think I'm going to go with localization of energy production and control. I see people wanting more control, right? This is Emma-like, right? People look at their values and they figure out how can they control their own destiny. And I just see lots of things that are driving towards a more local control model than a sort of central station model.
Yeah, and I think what's going to drive that is where my mind immediately goes. It's really not so much as an intersection, but a collision of great power competition and climate change.
Well, you both have done very well, and you kept the provocative thoughts going. So we want to give you the final word and message to give to our audience from today's discussion. What would you like them to take away? Todd, let's start with you.
I would say it's that energy is very important because it makes people's lives better. What energy we choose is a combination of technology, cost, social acceptance, and public policy levers, and we should approach the world thinking about it that way.
I agree with Todd 100%. I would just say, think first, what door, what lock do you want that energy system to unlock for you? What do you want to do with the energy? In what context? What are you willing to pay for what attribute? Therefore, think about what's the value of different choices.
Fantastic. We want to thank you both for joining us today. And you can be sure that our listeners are buzzing with ideas and questions. So I hope we can count on you to check back in the Energy Central community to follow up on any questions or comments that are left from today's episode. Until then, though, thanks again for sharing your insight with us in today's episode of the podcast. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Enjoyed it.
As did we. So you can always reach Todd and Steve through the Energy Central platform where they welcome your questions and comments. And we also want to give a shout out of thanks to the podcast sponsor that made today's episode possible. Thanks to West Monroe. West Monroe works with the nation's largest electric, gas, and water utilities in their telecommunication, grid modernization, and digital and workforce transformations. West Monroe brings a multidisciplinary team that blends utility, operations, and technology expertise to address modernizing aging infrastructure, advisory on transportation electrification, ADMS deployments, data analytics, and cybersecurity. And once again, I'm your host, Jason Price. So plug in and stay fully charged in the discussion by hopping into the community at energycentral.com, and we'll see you next time at the Energy Central Power Perspectives Podcast.